oil prices expected to rise today now as the fighting continues.
It was 1991. Or was it actually 2003? It doesn't really matter which footage you're looking at because the sequence is exactly the same. A war starts and the market slides, and inevitably, somewhere on a cable news channel, someone says it.
War is good business for parts of the economy.
That line has survived 80 years on the memory of a single conflict. A conflict that most of us weren't even alive for. A conflict where 40% of gross domestic product went towards defense. Where unemployment hit a crazy number. It was just 1%, and an entire generation came out the other side wealthier than they went in. That was World War II. And nothing since has looked anything like it. Modern wars are different. Modern wars don't mobilize the economy. They mobilize debt. The economic theme of World War II was everybody was all in. That meant factories were running at full production, and it meant full employment for the economy. But modern war is different. It's more about debt issuance and contractor pipelines. It isn't an entire nation coming together and everyone benefiting. It's a small group of people and companies that see the biggest rewards. And that's the distinction that nobody makes. And it's the distinction that determines whether a conflict builds broader prosperity or quietly transfers wealth from one group of people to another. The expectation that war is good for the economy isn't unreasonable because it comes from real history. During World War II, 40% of GDP went to defense. 17 million new jobs were created, and the country underwent full industrial conversion. Car factories started building tanks, appliance plants built ammunition casings. The American mainland was completely untouched by the war, while every other major participant in the war was physically destroyed. On top of that, there was a major benefit to American consumers. Forced savings through rationing and war bonds created a post-war consumer boom, unlike anything before or since. That's the template for the whole idea that war is good for the economy. And it's powerful enough that 3 generations later, it still shapes how people think about war and what it does to an economy. Then there are 3 modern conflicts that are more representative of the modern era. The Gulf War from 1990 to 1991 lasted 7 months and saw defense spending peak at roughly 0.5% of GDP, significantly less than the 40% of World War II. The Second Iraq War began in 2003, and defense spending was roughly 1% of GDP. Afghanistan stretched from 2001 to 2021, with costs peaking around $119 billion in 2011, which was about 0.8% of GDP. Now, those are meaningful numbers, but they aren't remake the entire economy numbers. There was no rationing, no war bonds, no industrial conversion, and no full employment surge. So the question is simple. If these wars didn't look like World War II, what did they actually do? And more importantly, who benefited and who didn't? Before the 2003 Iraq invasion, economists studied something unusual: real-time prediction markets. And yes, they were a thing back then, tracking the probability of war. What they found was striking. Every 10-point increase in the probability of an invasion raised oil prices about $1 per barrel and dropped the Standard & Poor's by about 1.5%. A full shift from peace to war implied oil being $10 higher and equities roughly 15% lower. The people with real money on the line, not the commentators, not politicians, but traders with actual positions, were pricing war as an economic negative. Later, the Federal Reserve noted the exact same pattern playing out in reverse. As invasion became certain, stocks rose and oil fell. That wasn't the market celebrating the war. It was the market pricing out the uncertainty of waiting. Once the outcome was decided, the uncertainty premium disappeared, which confirmed the same underlying mechanic the prediction markets had been showing for months. War wasn't a positive economic event, and the market knew it. The question is why the market knew it, because the answer isn't complicated. There are 3 mechanics that explain what modern war actually does to an economy, and they have repeated across every major American military conflict since 1945. Before we go further, though, there's a debate to be had here. The Gulf War was short. It was decisive, and on paper, it was almost free. Yes, believe it or not, the US government paid almost nothing for the Gulf War. The Government Accountability Office found that total United States costs exceeded $100 billion, including direct and indirect expenses. But allies committed cash of over $90 billion. In fact, in 1991, Allied contributions actually exceeded the US outlays for that war. Over several years, the US deficit impact was roughly $0.6 billion. Now, that's absolutely crazy. The US spent over $100 billion on the conflict, but the actual deficit impact was negligible. The US fought that war and essentially broke even on the books. But here's the problem with that whole success story. Americans, they still got a recession. The San Francisco Fed found that oil prices temporarily doubled. Consumer confidence fell 28% from mid-1990 to late 1990. And business investment weakened sharply. Their model concluded the US would have had slow growth, but no recession without the Gulf War. War was the final straw that tipped the economy into a recession. And the lesson here is that even when allies pay the entire bill, and even when the war is short and decisive, the oil shock and the confidence collapse can still damage the real economy. If the cheapest modern war in American history still caused a recession, the mechanic isn't about cost, it's about structure. Now let's test the same pattern without the safety net of allies funding it. The second round of Iraq and Afghanistan had no allies covering the bill. It wasn't a short timeline and there was no reimbursement. They also introduced an additional variable, a justification for war built on intelligence about weapons that may or may not have actually existed. There are three mechanics that determine what modern war actually does to the economy, and they have repeated in every single one of these conflicts. And they'll repeat the next one. Here's the first. Rule number one is the oil shock is the first wealth transfer, and it moves faster than any policy response can. The hidden character in every modern war isn't a general or a president, it's a contractor. The Department of Defense, or the Department of War, or whatever we're calling it these days, paid approximately $108 billion in Afghanistan contracts between 2001 and 2021. Brown University's cost of war project found that more than 40% of that total, over $43 billion, went to just 14 companies. That is the modern war economy, and it looks nothing like World War II. During the Second World War, military spending spread across the entire civilian economy. Every factory that converted to wartime production hired workers, paid wages, and created demand in the communities around it. Modern war spending doesn't spread that way. It flows through a narrow pipeline, from the Pentagon to a prime contractor to a subcontractor. Then the contractors, they lobby Congress for the next appropriation, which flows back to the Pentagon and starts the cycle all over again. It's a closed loop, with very few people and companies capturing the returns like they did in World War II. The public, who doesn't benefit, they end up absorbing the cost. In World War II, the mobilization was broad enough that it genuinely functioned as economic stimulus, creating millions of new jobs, building entire industries, and raising civilian wages across the board. But in Afghanistan, the same level of spending flowed through a pipeline that stayed open for 20 years and didn't close cleanly even when the war ended. Afghanistan received more than $2.8 billion in new appropriations in the 2.5 years after the last plane left. A lot of this money went to contractors. So the war ended, but the pipeline didn't. Now, just for fun, let's take a look at Iraq. In February of 2003, Colin Powell stood before the United Nations and presented what he called evidence of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, including satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and aluminum tubes he said were components for nuclear bombs. Virtually every single one of those claims was later proven false. The tubes were for rockets. The alleged mobile biological weapons labs produced weather balloons. The chemical stockpiles, they didn't exist. The CIA's own post-war investigator told Congress that we were almost all wrong. The economic commitment that followed that false narrative was authorized on the basis of that presentation. After the invasion, Iraq's spending peaked at about $143 billion in 2008. There was no mass mobilization that created jobs, no tax increases, no rationing, and no war bonds. So then, how was the war funded? Almost entirely through debt. Peak spending during that time reached roughly 1% of GDP, and the economy absorbed it without transforming at all. Brown University's updated figures show that the United States spent and obligated over $2.89 trillion on Iraq and Syria from 2003 to 2023, including $1.79 trillion in direct spending and $1.1 trillion in future veteran obligations. So that $38 trillion in debt, $1.1 trillion of it is directly related to the obligations from the second Iraq conflict. Every single dollar was debt financed, and more than $1 trillion in interest has already been paid on the combined post 9/11 war borrowing. So a war that was launched on false intelligence doesn't just waste money spent fighting it. It actually runs up the balance sheet, creating more national debt and an expense that'll go on for generations. Afghanistan, on the other hand, wasn't about the intensity of the spending. It was the duration. The war lasted 20 years. Spending peaked around 2011 at roughly $119 billion per year. Brown University attributes $3.41 trillion to Afghanistan. There was never a wartime boom like in World War II. It was a spending crisis that kept growing slowly and almost invisibly. Afghanistan is the clearest case study of a war whose economic story isn't wartime stimulus, but rather the slow growth of obligations. Those obligations, including veteran care and interest on the debt, they're still compounding to this day. The mechanics of World War II and the benefit of war on the economy, at least the perception of it, they only produce positive results under specific conditions. And when those conditions aren't met, it actually goes in the other direction, where it starts to reverse and destroy the economy and the wealth of individuals. The oil shock transfers wealth when the conflict threatens a real supply route, when the disruption lasts long enough to cascade through the broader economy, and when the affected population has no way to absorb the higher prices. The Gulf War met all three conditions. Oil doubled, the shock cascaded through consumer spending and business investment, and ordinary households had no hedge against the repricing. The recession, it was inevitable, and it happened within months. The debt financing mechanism, the borrowing for these wars, it compounds when the borrowing is long-term. When the spending doesn't create productive assets that benefit the public afterward, and when the obligations for veterans care, interest payments, and the reconstruction of the countries that were invaded last for decades after the fighting ends. Iraq and Afghanistan, they met all of those conditions. The borrowing was massive, the spending created no lasting civilian infrastructure or any benefit to the people of the United States, and the obligations are still growing more than 20 years later. When the conditions aren't met, the mechanics work differently. The Gulf War's budget impact was almost zero because Allied financing changed the conditions. The spending happened, but the debt didn't accumulate on the American balance sheet. Same war, same oil shock, but a fundamentally different fiscal outcome because one critical condition was altered. That's the difference between a war that damages the economy for a decade and one that damages it for a generation. The mechanics are the same every time, the conditions determine the severity. That's the first mechanic. War creates immediate wealth transfers through oil shocks and slow transfers through debt. And your position on the balance sheet, it determines which side you're on. But there's a second mechanic operating underneath. Rule number 2 is modern wars don't distribute wealth broadly. They concentrate it at choke points, meaning a small group of companies and people are the ones that reap the benefit. In every war economy, some participants are optional and some are not. The 14 companies that captured 40% of Afghanistan's spending weren't there by accident. They occupied positions that were essential to the war. They were irreplaceable in the short term. And that meant that they had pricing power that the Pentagon couldn't walk away from. That's the choke point mechanic, and it's what creates the most significant redistribution of wealth. At the geopolitical level, the Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point and carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, along with about 20% of the world's liquid natural gas. China receives half of its crude imports through that corridor. India receives nearly half, and Japan and South Korea are deeply dependent on it. There is no realistic alternative for most of that volume. It's not just a shipping lane. It's a single point of failure in the global energy system. When analysts model a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz, They project oil reaching $120 to $150 per barrel within days, with the probability of a global recession exceeding 75% within 30 days. The Strait of Hormuz, it's a choke point. The same mechanic operates inside the defense economy. When the Pentagon needs a specific weapon system and only one company can build it, that company, it sets the terms. When a war requires a specific type of armored vehicle and the production line takes years to establish, the manufacturer who ends up building those vehicles ends up with an amount of leverage that no competitive bidding can replicate. The companies that captured the bulk of Afghanistan's contracting dollars weren't just doing important work, they were doing work that nobody else could do on the timeline that the war demanded, which is why they were able to extract so much money from the US economy, while most people had no benefit as a result. And that's what separates a choke point from a commodity position. A commodity position means you do something necessary, but you're replaceable. And the system can find someone else to do it at a comparable price. A choke point means the system breaks if you disappear. Commodities, they compete on price. Choke points, they get to set the price. This is what separates modern war economics from the World War II model. And it's the reason the popular expectation of wartime prosperity keeps being wrong. In the Second World War, the spending was so large and so broadly distributed that it functioned as genuine economic stimulus. But modern wars don't work that way because the money doesn't spread the same way. In Iraq and Afghanistan, military spending flowed through narrow contractor pipelines to a concentrated group of recipients. The 14 companies and their subcontractors, they captured almost all of the returns. While the broad civilian economy, well, they basically paid for it. And they paid for it through higher oil prices, greater uncertainty, and a growing national debt that constrained everything else the government could do. And I'll show you in a minute here the potential impact that this has on the future. But the Gulf War showed this most clearly because it isolated the variables. Allies covered the military bill, so the budget impact was negligible. But the oil shock and the confidence collapse still produced a recession. The spending wasn't the problem. The structure of how modern war interacts with the civilian economy was the problem. And that structure hasn't changed since. Here's what sits underneath both of these rules. And it's the reason the popular narrative about war and the economy keeps getting it wrong. When people talk about war and the economy, they talk about aggregates. Gross domestic product goes up. Defense spending adds to growth. The headline number moves. And on paper, that's sometimes true. Military appropriations do show up in the national accounts as government spending. And government spending is a component of GDP. But aggregates don't tell you the whole story. It doesn't tell you who gains and who pays. They don't tell you that the oil shock transferred purchasing power from every household that drives a car or heats a home to every entity holding energy assets. They don't tell you that the defense appropriation flowed through a pipeline to 14 firms rather than spreading across the civilian economy. And they don't tell you that the debt used to finance the whole thing will generate interest payments for the next 30 years, quietly reducing the government's ability to respond to anything else. That's what these two rules reveal when you put them together. The GDP number can tick upward on a quarter of defense spending, while the actual wealth in the system is moving in the opposite direction, away from the broad population and toward a narrow set of positions that were structured to capture it. The headline says growth, but the reality is the money's being transferred from one group of people to another. Every modern conflict has produced exactly this combination. Okay, so that's two mechanics covered. And if we ended the story right here, it would already explain why modern wars don't actually help the economy. But there's a problem with stopping at just two rules, because both of them describe what happens during the war. But the most expensive part of a modern war isn't the war itself. It's everything that comes after. So rule number 3 is the real cost of a modern war isn't the war. It's the decades of debt, interest, and obligations that follow it. Everything covered so far, the oil shock, the debt, the contractor pipeline, those are the mechanics of the war itself. The war ends, but the mechanics don't. When the last military plane left Kabul, Afghanistan was officially over, but veterans continued filing new disability claims, with future obligations exceeding $1 trillion. Interest keeps compounding on 20 years worth of borrowing, and new appropriations, they kept flowing. $2.8 billion worth. And that's in the last 2.5 years after withdrawal. Iraq tells the same story. Combat operations formally ended years ago, but Brown University's accounting shows obligations stretching into the 2050s, including veterans care, interest payments, and residual security assistance. The $2.89 trillion in spending and obligations through 2023 is not the final number. It's the number so far. The mechanic here is straightforward. War creates the debt generates interest, and the interest payments limit the government's capacity to respond to the next crisis. And each time, the starting position is worse than the time before. The US entered World War II with debt that was high but about to be dwarfed by explosive economic growth. It entered Iraq in 2003 with debt to GDP around 60% and climbing. Afghanistan's peak spending years were during the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. By 2026, the federal debt exceeds $38 trillion, and interest payments alone consume approximately $1 trillion per year. That's the starting line before a single new dollar is spent, whether it's on a military crisis, a financial crisis, a pandemic, or something else. And this is where the popular narrative finally and completely breaks. Modern wars don't create full employment. They don't transform industry. They don't expand middle-class prosperity. And they don't generate a post-war consumer boom. GDP may pick up during defense spending quarters, but households don't actually benefit. What modern wars actually create is a very long tail of obligations that outlast the conflict itself, financed by debt that generates its own costs in perpetuity. This is effectively the same mechanism as a person borrowing money on a credit card and only making the minimum payment. Each month that only the minimum payment is made, the problem is becoming worse and worse and worse. And because of this, the war ends up being temporary, but the balance sheet impact is permanent. World War II asked every American to pay to get behind the war. Modern wars ask no one to pay, but secretly, everyone ends up paying later. And this creates a massive problem, an inability to respond as aggressively to the next crisis because the balance sheet is already loaded. And every time there's a new crisis, the starting point is worse. What happens when the next conflict or crisis starts? That's not a rhetorical question, it's a structural one. And the answer depends entirely on the same three mechanics. So now the three rules are connecting. And they have to, because none of them explain the full picture on their own. The oil shock explains why markets react the way they do in a conflict, but it doesn't explain why the economic damage persists long after the oil price normalizes. The choke point concentration explains why wartime spending doesn't create broad prosperity, but it doesn't explain why the fiscal burden keeps growing after the fighting stops. The debt rule, the fiscal tail, explains why modern wars are so much more expensive than they appear in real time, but it doesn't explain why the cost falls on the general public rather than on the people who captured the wartime spending. This same combination is played out across every modern American military conflict. Different headlines, different presidents, different theaters, but the same three mechanics producing the same structural outcome every time. And it just continues to get worse. None of these three conflicts created broad prosperity like World War II did. All of them transferred wealth in the same direction through the same three mechanisms. The Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan span three conflicts across 3 decades, but they reveal one pattern. The oil spike hits first, the contractor pipeline captures the spending, the debt compounds for a generation, maybe more, and the war ends, but the obligations don't. But the people who are getting wealthy during wartime, they aren't seeing different information than the rest of us. They're reading between the lines of the headlines, including the oil exposure, the choke point positions, and the debt structure. And at the end of the day, the war will end, but the debt, it's going to remain. And quite frankly, it's one of the scariest economic experiments in the history of the modern economy. Oh, and if you want to see a video that talks about the other scariest experiments in the US economy, check out this video right here.